I don't know if this is a shared emotion. I think it might be, though. This has been just a remarkably compelling and convicting passage of Scripture and series through the Bible as we look at Ecclesiastes in my own life. I hope that that's a shared feeling. I think one of the reasons is because as we've navigated through the book of Ecclesiastes, and believe it or not, even though we're sort of still in the first third of the book, we're about to close up this series pretty quickly because he has this tendency to sort of elaborate and repeat the concepts that he's introduced. And so what we've done is sort of, as we've walked through each concept, not only taken the spots in Scripture early on, but then sort of seen how he accentuates it later. But in that, I think the thing that has been really overwhelmingly evident time and time again is that though Solomon, the man who writes Ecclesiastes, is professing and writing and proclaiming some things from close to 3,000 years ago, what he says and what he's looking at and observing and commenting on is remarkably true to this very day. What he's got to say about life under the sun is surprisingly and just kind of incredibly accurate to what each and every one of us has a tendency to experience day in and day out in our lives. You see, Solomon has kind of walked through this journey. He's writing this near the end of his life, and what he's observing is the futility or the vanity, depending on the Bible translation you have. The word is hevel, the meaninglessness of life under the sun, that here on this earth, in this world, there is a certain level of disappointment in all of the things that life kind of presents itself to be. And not only that, he doesn't just kind of leave it at that, but rather he then begins to, in this thesis, break down thing after thing after thing after thing that he has experienced, and experienced it in more fullness than you and I ever will, and each one has proven itself a disappointment. Each one has proven itself hevel. And so we just kind of tackled them one by one and said, okay, let's look at wisdom. Solomon had asked God for wisdom and had received it. Historically, we find that at that time he was the wisest and smartest man in the known world, that people were traveling from nations near and far to come and hear and experience the wisdom of Solomon, to get the counsel or the advice of Solomon because of his great wisdom. And what he says is, at the end, all of this wisdom just brought about a lot of knowledge and understanding of pain and difficulty and injustice and the terrible things of this world, that ultimately having much wisdom led to much grief. Therefore, it was hevel. It looked very great and appealing, but it was disappointing. So he said from there, he turned to some other things. He said, I turned to pleasure. I turned to wealth. And I turned to sex, and I turned to comedy, and I turned to wine, and I turned to anything that I could really find that would just change my state of being. And I went to all of these things to great extent, and even a variety of extents. When he talks about his experimentation with wine, he says, I both kept my mind in it, I was a wine connoisseur, and I experienced all kind of foolishness and folly. I just got, completely inebriated. And so in this, he said, it didn't matter what I tried, what I found was at the end of it, all of these things were hevel. They just disappointed. He goes, I even went from there to start accomplishing things, and I made my works large, and I did all of this stuff. I built forests and houses and ponds that are still there to this day, the craters of the lakes that he had dug out. I had slaves upon slaves upon slaves, people that worked for me. I threw big parties, and it was all hevel. it was all disappointing. It was all meaningless. There is a certain level of lacking in this world under the sun. And last week we kind of brought that even further and said in all of it, what Solomon has had his eyes open to and observed more and more and more is that though it might seem that if we do right, we get good, and if we do bad, we get bad, that oftentimes in this heavenless world, that's not a word, we'll use it, in this heavenless world, it just doesn't work out that way. Those who do evil seem to get good oftentimes, and those who do good still seem to be stuck with some pain and some problems and some difficulties. It just doesn't translate the way that you would expect it to translate, that there's such injustice in this world. And so these things, all of these things, I think as we look 3,000 years later in the United States, in our context, in our lives, have this way of sort of resonating with us. It just kind of says this is what life is still like, that people chase after all these different things, believing that something in it is going to bring joy, is going to bring satisfaction, is going to bring lasting meaning in life. And what happens is one after the next, after the next, after the next, seem to disappoint. Now, what this fact has a tendency to do in and amongst many lives, especially those who don't profess Christianity, don't know Christ, is it has a tendency to lead to a very fatalistic view of life. Who cares? So what? Everything is by chance. Everybody's going to die, and so it doesn't matter. Nothing matters at all. There's no purpose in all of this. In fact, at times you see Solomon sort of walking this tightrope. However, the reason he writes Ecclesiastes is because he's learned that ultimately that's not true. And the reason that's not true is because life, as we know it, is not created only to be lived under the sun. But rather that the disappointment of this life under the sun is meant to ultimately point us to a solution that is beyond the sun. It's ultimately meant to point us to God and say God exists beyond the sun, and though under the sun things might just seem awry, it might not seem right, that there's something more than this. There's something bigger than this. And then the second thing he's consistent in doing in this is going, that's true, but it also means that you've got to find a way to live here. You've got to find a way to live life under the sun in the midst of all of this hevel. In the midst of all of this chaos, in the midst of all of this vanity, how are you going to live? And what we find, and what you may have noticed already, if not, I'm going to read a few of them to you this morning, but consistently throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon's solution to this is to talk about what it looks like to experience, to set up some ways to know joy in the midst of a world that sometimes can just seem messed up. It can just seem wrong. And so what he does is he kind of lays out some things, and then he gives these kind of therefore, or I've observed statements, some ways for us to deal with the hevel. He says in Ecclesiastes 3, chapter 3, verse 12, he says, I know there's nothing better than for men, to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is a gift from God. I know that everything God does will remain forever, and there is nothing to add to it, and there's nothing to take from it, for God has so worked that men should fear him. He says that ultimately you're meant to do good, you're meant to enjoy it, knowing that it's a gift of God, and that God is working things in a way men ought to fear him. In verse 22 of chapter 3, he says, I've seen that nothing is better than that man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot, for who will bring him to see what will occur after him. In chapter 5, verse 18, he says, here is what I've seen, to be good and fitting, to eat, to drink, and enjoy oneself in all of one's labor in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him, for this is his reward. In chapter 9, verses 7 through 9, he says, go then, eat your bread in happiness, drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has already approved your work. Let your clothes be white white all the time, and let oil not be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the woman you love all of the days of your fleeting life, which he has given to you under the sun. For this is the reward in life, and your toil in which you've labored under the sun. So there's this kind of, life is fleeting, but you are meant to find some enjoyment in the present in this. He's kind of building into his writing these tools that we're meant to use in order to live in this world. And so today, the one I want to look at in chapter 4 is the one that I think is probably one of the most well-known passages in Ecclesiastes. And honestly, I believe that this is the most important thing for you to experience joy in this life under the sun. The tool that Solomon is going to advocate for here is the most valuable of all of the things for the sake of our joy under the sun, right? So we would say, first of all, going beyond the sun. So Jesus Christ is the source of real, true joy in life. But if we're going to look and go, how do we operate in this lifetime? What's the way that we experience joy in this lifetime? What are we to do? Solomon in chapter 4 is going to lay out the one that I think is the most important, and it's the necessity of real community in our lives. Real relationships, real community in our lives. Look at it with me, and then let's just talk about what Solomon says and why it's so important. Verse 9 of chapter 4. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. Here's what I want to pose to you today. That community, relationships, are the most important thing for a joyous, satisfying life under the sun. Real community is a necessity for the Christian life. It's a non-negotiable, and it's needed. In fact, I'm always overwhelmed by this truth, right? If you go to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God is creating. If you think about the Genesis account, there's a day God creates, and at the end of the day, it says there's evening, there's morning, the first day, and at the end of all of these days, there's this repetitive phrase that God sees what has been created, and it's what? It's good. Yeah, the word is it's good. Genesis 2, verse 18, introduces us to the first thing that's not good in the universe. Here's the thing that's so crazy. Sin has yet to enter the picture. Naturally, we would go, sin is the first thing that's not good in the universe. It's not true. Genesis 2:18 tells us the first thing that's not good, and God says it's that man should not be alone. It's not good for man to be alone. Therefore, I'll make a suitable helper for him. The first thing in all of the universe that is shown to be awry and espoused as a value is that we are relational beings, that we are meant to be in community. This is what Solomon is echoing when he says this, that a community is vital to your life under the sun. It's vital to you having any sort of value and satisfaction and joy under the sun. He gives 3 reasons. I want to look through these verses again and kind of give you some just practical reasons why Solomon says this is true. It's all throughout Scripture and consistent in the Bible as to why we need good relationships. We need real community in our life. You need to be a part of a church. You need to have good, valuable friendships, deep and meaningful relationships. But Solomon here is going to give a few reasons that I think are tangible, even 3,000 years later, important for us, and just interact with our lives over and over and over and over again. Look at verse 9 with me. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. He says when you have two people working, you get more done than if you have one person working. That two get a better return for their labor than one oftentimes. If you've ever done like construction or home projects or things that involve carrying heavy stuff, you know this to be true, right? One person can toil on their own for long periods of time, and yet two can often get the work done much quicker and much more efficiently. Not only that, but I think what Solomon also means by this is that the fruit of labor, the fruit of our labor, is more productive and it's more joyous when you have deep and real community, when you have someone to share it with. That when we work, when we experience things, when we find the outcome of things, that we ultimately want to tell someone about it, because that's where the joy in those things often comes from. All right, so think about those of you who maybe do like around the house projects, right? We very early in our marriage, I had explained to Whitney, I'm not a handy guy. I'm not going to do that. We're going to buy stuff that is done, turnkey, complete, because I'm not going to work on houses. We've remodeled 3 houses now. So if you're a future husband, just know it's coming, right? And so we began to kind of do these things. Well, one of the things that happens every time you finish a project, those of you who do projects, what's the very first thing you want to do when you finish a project? Go show it to somebody, right? You want to tell someone about it. Why? Because in its completion, joy is found not in the work itself. Joy is found in the community that you're able to share it with. I remember when I went to college, it was a very interesting time for me. I was 18 years old, and quite frankly, I loved but despised my parents. All right? Come on, Sunday after Thanksgiving, I see some grown adult children here. You don't have to raise your hand. It'd be bad for you, I know. I was so excited to get out of the house. I was so excited to get away. I was so excited to just kind of leave the shadow of mom and dad. Mom especially, she knows this, so it's cool now. But I just wanted out. And I got to school. And not only did I get away from mom and dad, but here's what you find out. You get away from your friends. You get away from the teachers you know. You get away from your neighbors. You get away from all of your support system. And I remember the first couple weeks in my freshman year of college being so lonely and trying to find meaningful relationships. And something really crazy happened. I started to call my mom. Not like for 3 minutes, like for hours. And over the course of the first month of my freshman year of college, my relationship with my mom transformed entirely. Why? Because ultimately we desire to share our lives with others. We desire community because the fruit of your labor is meant to be shared. And in that, we find greater return. We find greater joy in it. He keeps going though. Look at this in verse 10. He gives the flip side of this. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there's not another to lift him up. Can I give you the second thing? Real community picks up one another when we fall. Here's the thing. We all have areas of our lives where we're not doing what we ought to be doing. Right? We have these kind of blind spots in our lives. We have these things that just aren't right, that just need to be fixed, that need to be changed. You know what happens to people who don't have real community in their lives? Nothing. In those areas of their life, nothing happens. Because the thing about a blind spot is you can't see it. And so what happens is those who don't have community live lives where when they stumble and they fall and they do things that are awry, they just have a tendency to continue in those things because there's no one in their life that's honest enough and loves them and cares for them enough to help them out of it and go, hey, how can we fix this? How can we change this? I see an area of your life where things are going off the rails. We need to make some adjustments. We need to make some changes. This needs to be different. And when you don't have that, the same thing happens over and over and over and over again. But real community means that someone picks you up when you fall, and you pick others up when they fall. He keeps going. He says, furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? This is, I want to explain this in today's terms, right? This is you went camping this time of year without any blankets, and it got real cold at night, right? And so in order to keep warm, you went with someone else and you spoon, right? You share body heat. I pray, if I go camping with any one of you other than my wife, I pray this never ever happens, all right? It's why I'm not going camping. But in this, right, he's saying you ultimately are able to experience life with someone else, even in the most miserable of situations. That ultimately you are able to grow with one another in times of pain, in times of testing, in times of difficulty. Look how he continues it on. It says, and if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of three strands is not quickly torn apart. That there is this hevel in life, this injustice in life, this times of trial and pain and difficulty. And ultimately, there's a lot of times that life becomes kind of miserable. And what you find is that if you have real relational community with people who love one another, people who love the Lord and love you, that those times of misery just aren't quite as bad. They're just not quite as miserable. I remember a few years ago, this opportunity to lead a short-term mission team into an area in rural Mexico. And we were working with some orphans in rural Mexico and kind of these group homes that dealt with 70, 80, 100 orphans that lived in these facilities, and there were some workers that would take care of them. And so in and amongst this trip, one of the things we wanted to do was help them build their facilities up so that these kids had a place to sleep. And so we get there, and the guy who's leading the trip, his name was Mauricio. Mauricio on the first day goes, well, why don't we drive out there? We'll just see the site. We had just landed the plane, kind of got in. We're all in our travel clothes and just tired, wore out. And he goes, let's just drive out there. We'll just see it, and then tomorrow we'll come back and work. So nobody's kind of prepared to do anything other than to walk through the place. Well, we get out there, and they are working at the time, and they're building. And the thing is, down there, construction they don't use wood. Okay, it's the desert. It's a million degrees and there's no trees, and so what they use is cement. Everything is masonry, and so they're pouring a beam to go across for the roof of this building. So 12 feet in the air, there's a piece of scaffolding, and there's forms for 2 feet wide by 3 foot deep by 20 feet across beam, and they're mixing cement by hand in a 5-gallon bucket and lifting it up the scaffolding and pouring it in this beam. That's a lot of 5-gallon buckets. Okay, here's what happens. You guys ready? Ready for what? No, we're not ready. He goes, well, let's go. Roll up your sleeves. No gloves, no work clothes, 160,000 degrees outside, and we begin to set up, and all of these people get in line, shoveling dirt, shoveling sand, putting cement together, mixing it, shoveling it out, putting it in a 5-gallon bucket. My younger brother's on the trip with me, and so he's at the bottom of the scaffolding, lifting up buckets, and I'm sitting halfway up the scaffolding, and I'm grabbing buckets and I'm handing them to Mauricio, this missionary, and he's taking the bucket and he's pouring the cement in, and then he's tossing it down, and I swear every third bucket I'm like, hey, are we done yet? He's like, no, we've poured 6 buckets in, right? 3 more buckets is like the kid in the car, like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And he just kind of notices that I'm complaining quite a bit. In fact, like as we continue to do this, my hands start to kind of break open. You're not wearing any gloves, and like the concrete is getting in there. It's like burning your hands, and I'm just got a bad attitude about it. It just seemed miserable. And in fact, the sun goes under a cloud, and I was like, man, this is the best feeling that I've had so far today. And he looks at me, this missionary Mauricio, he smiles. He goes, I like to think about the sun as God smiling down on our work. But I'm just going to throw this bucket at you, right? Like I was so done with it. And then we got home that night. We got back to the mission facility and get a shower, and nobody can really move. Every part of their body aches. You got pain in muscles you didn't know you had. You're just trying to rest a little bit. And I look at my younger brother, and he says, what's crazy? He says, miserable as this was miserable together. And we'll remember this for the rest of our lives. For the rest of our lives. Because even in the hevel of life, even amongst resistance, you need community. Because it makes the worst things not so bad. But here's the thing. I don't think that it's a foreign concept to us to say we need real, meaningful relationships. I think whether you'd admit it or not, you know it to be true. But for so many of us, we just don't have them. Why is that? Well, Solomon answers that too. In fact, he answered it before he actually lays out the value. Go back with me to verse 4. I want to give you 4 things that he says kills real community. Verse 4, I've seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. This too is vanity and striving after the wind. Here's the first thing that kills it. It's envy. A jealousy and a hatred for others having success is ultimately what destroys real community. And the thing is, culturally, we're not even really trying to hide that anymore. I saw this commercial. I'm going to play it for you in just a second here. But I saw this commercial this week that just really describes ultimately one of the ways that we see real community just annihilated and just destroyed from us. You got that? You got that, guys? Can we play that?
There he is, your new brother-in-law. You like him. He's one of those guys who always smells good. His 5 o'clock shadow is always at 5 o'clock. You like him. Your mom says he's done really well for himself. He has stocks and bonds. Your dad wants to go fishing with him. Your dad doesn't even like fishing. You like your brother-in-law, but you'd like him better if you made more money than he does. Don't get mad at your brother-in-law. Get E-Trade.
I thought, what a great depiction on a life of selfish jealousy that breaks down real and meaningful community. Because what happens is it just leaves us pretending that we're happy for people when we're really not. Just leaves us pretending to invest in somebody's life when ultimately we're just kind of waiting for them to stumble so that we might look better than them. Solomon says, you do this and it will be striving after the wind. It'll ultimately destroy any chance you have at deep and meaningful relationships in the Lord. He keeps going. Look at verse 5. It says, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. The second thing that Solomon mentions is just plain and simple laziness. You know why many of you don't have very many real and deep relationships? Because you're lazy. Many of you won't experience real, meaningful community in your life because it takes a lot of work. Because it's hard. Because it means that you have to sacrifice what ultimately is easiest for you time and time again to go and to care for somebody else. It means that you have to decide that what your prerogative for that day is might not be as important as what someone else's is. And so oftentimes what we have this tendency to do is to slip into just a pattern of laziness, a pattern of selfishness that just says, I don't care enough to find real community. I don't care enough to invest in others. I don't care enough to think less of myself and love other people. And it strips us, it robs us of any chance for real, deep relationships. He keeps going. In fact, he gives the complete opposite of this. He says, on one hand, this is verse 6, is full of rest. One hand full of rest is better than two fists full of labor and striving after the wind. Then I looked again at the vanity under the sun. You know what else happens? One of us gets lazy. The other chases after some future form of contentment that they just can't see in the present. It's that attitude that the future is always when life is going to make sense. And so you just put your head down and you chase after something that's coming, that just never arrives. You spend all of your time in school believing that if you just set aside some things and work hard, you'll get a better job. And then you spend all your time in work just believing that if you set aside some of the things that matter and work harder and do more, you're going to have a better retirement. And then we get there and it just disappoints. Because your whole life is spent thinking about the next thing, thinking about some future contentment that you don't have in the present. And one of the things that happens with it is all along the way you sacrifice relationships. All along the way you sacrifice what really matters, believing that someday it's just going to fix itself. Solomon says you're wrong. In fact, he says in verse 8, there's a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there's no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of this pleasure? This too is vanity, and it's a grievous task. Can I tell you what I think is the biggest hindrance to community in and amongst our area, our culture? It's busyness. It's work. It's filling your life with so much stuff, so much labor, so much chasing after nothing, that all along the way you go, I'm too busy. Too busy to build relationships with my kids. I'm too busy to build relationships with my spouse. I'm too busy to have deep and meaningful friendships. I'm too busy to identify people in my life who are going to hold me accountable, who are going to pick me up when I fall, who are going to spur me on to do better in my life. I'm too busy for all of this. And Solomon says, at the end of all of it, you will find that that is a grievous task. Solomon's point is this: if you want to survive, if you want to thrive, experience real joy in this life under the sun, you need to do it in community. You need to do it with relationships. Now I want to plead with you and kind of make one final point. Many people find this in places outside of the church. Many people find their community at a country club, amongst some volunteer organization, with some friends in their neighborhood. Many people look for community in a whole bunch of different places. Here's the problem with that, and the danger in that, if I'm just being honest. The idea of community is that it's people in unity. It's in the word, unity. When your community, when your relational connection isn't built on Christ, ultimately what's going to happen is at some point, in some way, and in some time, it's going to be severed by something that you value and treasure that the other side of the community doesn't value and treasure. The only way community can really last, the only way community can really thrive, the only way community can really share on its deepest level is if it's founded on the most important thing in all of your life. And Solomon consistently, throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, and the Bible consistently from cover to cover, is going to remind you, is going to plead with you, is going to tell you that the most important thing in each and every one of our lives is not under the sun, it's beyond the sun. And so ultimately, if you want to have the most meaningful, the deepest level of community, it has to be founded on the rock that is Jesus Christ, because it's the only thing that will never break down, it'll never subside, it'll never become less important, it'll never change, it's constant, and it's there for you. And so if we want to be a church that ultimately finds value, we have to find it beyond the sun. And if we want to exist in this life under the sun, we have to have real community that helps one another, real community that loves one another, real relationships that build on one another, all the while pointing us to what is beyond the sun, which is Jesus Christ and Him crucified for you and for me. I want so deeply for us to be a people and to continue to be a people who treasure Jesus Christ, and we do it together. We do it loving one another. We do it in deep and meaningful relationships, because it's the only way you'll find deep and lasting joy under the sun. Pray with me.